Spiritual surrender. So this is a term that we may have heard, um, but I suspect for most of it was something that um, we assigned some, maybe some future possibility to. Nothing that needed to be contemplated right now. Maybe in the future sometime, but um, we'll wait and see. It's not something that we eagerly look forward to. I mean, I suppose we could if we imagine, how wonderful it would be to just give ourselves to the divine, and I mean that's also a path. Um, but there, I think for most of us, when we first hear that term, we may not say this out loud because it's not very spiritual, but um, we may have the sense of surrender. Okay, what's in it for me? And the answer to that, of course, is, well, nothing, right? And everything, paradoxically, right? Nothing in from the perspective of a personal separate self, and everything in terms of our real true nature, discovering what that is. So when we first are introduced to spirituality, um, everything's new and exciting, and we may give it a whirl, try it out. We've heard that peace and um, bodily relaxation, and maybe a few wondrous experiences may be in store. So it sounds great, So we give it a try, and all those things are possible and may even um, occur when we're new to any kind of meditative process or contemplation. So by that, I don't mean necessarily sitting. It can take that form for some people, and other people, it may be more in the form of just contemplating our existence. Um, but whichever approach that we take, it won't be long before we realize that it's not all just about peace and joy, that there can be some more challenges to it, that we can find that sometimes it is peace and lovely, and other times it can be quite challenging. One of the things that we can discover when we're just alone with our own thoughts is that our thoughts are a bit unruly. We can't always control them. We can't always think what we want to think. We can't always have the experience that we want to have. And so we realize that there's a mental component to this. It's not just um, practice where the results are guaranteed not to fail. So this can be a little more challenging, and at this point, a lot of people uh, can choose to either give up the practice altogether or just buckle down and try harder to try to control their experience, um, which can work, for some time to a certain degree, or they just settle for the somatic um, benefits of meditation and silence and just being more gentle on the body, and that's fine too. There's no problem with that. So, but if for those of us who, for whatever reason, decide to go a little further, we can find ourselves in more challenging territory. We can find that um, the consequences of becoming identified with our thoughts, the sort of sticky quality of that, um, the reality of those thoughts, the conditioning that in which those thoughts are based and have developed over a lifetime. Um, we find that we have to learn how to deal with the sense of boredom, to sit when we don't really feel like sitting, to be quiet when we have much more interesting things to do. We might find that we are dealing with old memories, old patterns that arise that we didn't really want to deal with. Um, and yet, when we become quiet, um, sometimes we're forced to look at those. It's almost like there's that opportunity um, where we can't escape from that arising of a particular memory, painful situation, old patterning that we have to really look at. And out of that, we can have profound insights. We can see things about ourselves that we may not have realized before. So there's, it can be challenging work, but it can also be rewarding work too. That begin to catch on that this um, spiritual process is not just about feeling good. It's not just about achieving a comfortable state that we'd all like to achieve. It's really about uh, dealing with the reality of what we are. And so these insights aren't necessarily all pleasant. Sometimes they're real uplifting. Sometimes they're just hard to see, but they tend to have a ring of truth about them. That they're undeniably true, and for that, um, there can be a sense of gratitude for having seen the reality of that. And as we begin to catch on to how this process really works at a deeper level, we can see that it is an unraveling of patterns that we've inherited, that we've uh, assumed over the course of a lifetime. So we can see that, or begin to see that this isn't really just philosophical exercise. It's not, it's just not an armchair um, mental conceptual exercise. It's really about the essence of what we are. And that can come as a surprise because things that we've learned in the past, for example, going to school, growing up, it was always about learning about something really outside of ourselves. Even if we were talking about human biology, it was still learning about something as if it were um, an outside subject. We were looking at a thing outside of ourselves, namely a human body, um, or any other subject that we might be studying. I remember Adyashanti telling the story that, I don't know, might have been 3 years into his meditation. And in those days, he was meditating a lot, like 3, 4, 5 hours a day of meditation, and was into, I'm not sure, but it may have been 2 or 3 years of that intensity of meditation before the thought occurred to him, I wonder who it is that's meditating. Right? You would think that would be one of the first things that you'd think of before you ever sat down to meditation, but um, I would say for nearly all of us, it's not. When we first sit down, it's like, how is this going to work? What can I attain? What can I learn? Will it be exciting? Um, maybe I'll see something spectacular. So it's an outward looking. So this question really turned the tables onto um, the question of who was it that was actually engaging in this intensity of activity? who was it that was actually meditating? What was that? What was that about? So it really turned the direction of his um, inquiry really 180 degrees from looking out for some experiential attainment to looking back at what was it that was doing all the seeking. Okay, so a major shift in direction, and there comes a point as we get further and further into what the spiritual journey is really about. We can see that there's an intensity to it. It's serious work. It requires a level of diligence. We might find it taking up more of our time and energy and attention, and having it come to us frequently throughout the day. And at some point, we um, realize that we've seen too much. We've come too far. And up until that point, we may sort of harbor a vague idea that, if things get too uncomfortable, if they get too far out of my comfort zone, I can always walk away from this. Right? There may come a point where that's no longer an option. It's like we've seen too much. We've tasted the reality of this process to the point where we can't, with any degree of self-honesty, just walk away from it. Even if we walk away from it, we're still here. We're still living life. We're still learning however we learn. But this point of recognizing that we've come too far to turn back, to turn our back on this self-exploration, um, Ramana Maharshi fondly called it being caught in the tiger's mouth. That sounds like it's not a good thing, right? But it actually is. It's actually a grace, um, because it's the wisdom of no alternative, right? Once we've actually recognized that turning back, turning away isn't an option, we can save ourselves a lot of mental anguish about wondering whether we should go further or not, or um, because part the way through this process is not necessarily a comfortable spot to end up. Um, Much better to continue the journey, finish the treatment, and then get on with life. Right? Go all the way through. That's the liberation. That's the freedom. So this wisdom of no escape has value because it sort of focuses our effort. We're no longer questioning, do I, look a little deeper or not, or it is really opening up ourselves up to look wherever that thread leads. Right? Anybody have that experience where there's just a willingness to follow it? Not even so much courage. It's just um, you just compelled somehow to do it, and it's only our self-honesty and willingness, and actually the intensity of our longing that continues to push us further down that road. So we can come to a point where we realize that up until that point, it can feel like we're the ones pursuing spirituality. We're in pursuit, right? We're making the effort, and that there comes a point where we realize that the tables have turned, and that we're the ones that are being pursued. Right. Feels like we've opened ourselves sufficiently that the greater forces of life have um, taken that as an invitation to assist in that process. And there can be a feeling while there's suddenly a momentum, uh, a movement that is beyond our personal effort. And that can be surprising at first. And our job at that point is to allow it to happen because that life force knows what is needed far, far better than we do. It can feel odd, it can feel surprising, but that is the time to let it happen, right? Effort, 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 and then more let it happen, let it go, let it be. So what's being called for at this point is our identity, identity of what we believe ourselves to be. And that can feel very personal. Now it's no longer, examining things, learning about things outside of ourselves. It is our very identity that's at stake. It's not actually our real identity, it's just our mistaken identity. But if that's the only identity that we know, it feels like the whole ball of wax. Right? It feels like our very existence is at stake. It can even feel when this energy really ramps up, it can even have the feeling that we're, you know, being led to the gallows. You know? Not actually, but if our identity is parked in this body mind as being the entirety of what we are, that identity is what is at stake. So it can feel like our very existence is uh, at threat. Not really, but that movement can feel like a psychological death. It can feel like the relinquishment of our identity with everything that we thought we were. This form, this body, mind, all our beliefs, all our ideas, our concepts, our philosophies, everything is at stake. So what's being called for is the relinquishment of that identity. That we can't do, right? Because that identity is comprised of resistance. Our ego is, uh, that sense of ego is the result of a resistance against what is. Right? If there's no resistance at all against whatever is arising, then there's nothing to separate ourselves from the rest of existence. There's nothing to separate us from that. There's already a sense of oneness, sense of separation is absent. But as soon as we um, find ourselves resisting, putting ourselves in opposition to what is happening, that creates and perpetuates this sense of self. The other thing that perpetuates it is just, it's not even a belief because we never really took it on as a belief. Um, the sense of, separate, independent entity, a separate individual, especially strong in this country, rugged individualism, right? It's looked up to, it's considered, um, a mark of adulthood. But we never consciously took on that belief. We never decided at some point, you know what, I've decided to be a separate individual. I have a choice. I could be just spacious awareness, but I've decided to be a separate, self-limited individual. No, it didn't happen that way. We don't actually know how it happened or when. Um, it's probably a function of just mimicry. Everybody else proceeded, acted, talked about as if they were quite certain that they were a separate individual, and we just assumed that's the way it was, and maybe didn't even have a problem with it until we got to a point where it just felt like a tight-fitting suit, like it was just constraining us in a way that kept us separate from other people, kept us separate from the world, kept us from actually loving one another. Then we began to wonder, what this separation, sense of separation was, how it arose. Um, so it's not even that we decided to take it on. We never even, it never even rose to that level of consciousness. It was just somehow, it was there at some point in our life. It was, we just found ourselves functioning as and being quite certain that we were a separate individual. And then we get into spirituality, and then we try to think, well, how do I attain this unity that I've heard about, this oneness? Well, the separate self, trying to imagine how it's going to attain unity, the separate self never will. It can't. It, it is the argument against unity, and it can't just by its own bootstraps um, can't ever give that up. What it can do is investigate really carefully what's holding it together, what that sense of separation is really comprised of. And it's comprised of a belief that that's what we are. So we can look at the beliefs, not from the perspective of, I just want them to go away, but out of real curiosity, like I wonder if that's actually true, if that's actually what I am. What are the consequences of believing that? How do I feel? How do I act in the world when I presume that that is my deepest nature? My deepest nature is limited to this um, personal separate self. And I believe that, how do I interact with other people? Am I defensive or am I open? Am I loving, not in a personal sense, but just open-hearted? Or am I always looking at things from the perspective of what's in it for me? So we can't actually get rid of this sense of ego or the sense of separation directly. Like, I just want to get rid of it. If I try real hard, I'll just get rid of it. Because this is the ego trying to make life better for itself. Right? It won't ever do that. It can't. So just the attempt to do that is sort of like jousting at windmills. It doesn't have any effect because there is not actually such a thing as a separate self, just an idea, just a concept. It doesn't actually exist. What does exist is this spaciousness, this awareness that's present already. This is what we pointed to earlier. Just this openness to whatever arises. That is already present. But what ties us to this sense of separate self is actually the belief in um, what I am is this body mind. That's the belief that holds this whole house of cards together. The belief that that's what I am. And that belief was never taken on consciously. It was just, it's really just an it's an assumed um, truism, an unexamined, um, assumed truism. So we can allow that to see that that's what's happening. We can't fight that directly, but we can really question the belief that's holding all of that together. That's what we can do. The truth of it is that we're not actually separate ever. That's the actual truth of it. Um, but just believing that as a concept doesn't actually do us any good. So when we come to this point of um, realizing that what's at stake is this identity of what we take ourselves to be, um, like I said, there's an intensity to it. Um, and it's hard to anticipate that until you're actually in that position of that being challenged by life, because there can be that sense of impending demise, right? Again, it's the demise of the false self. That's what's actually at stake. It's the demise of the psychological self that we take ourselves to be. But it can feel like the real thing. It can feel like, no, it's actually life or death here, folks. So it's useful in that moment, if we've gone through some time in the spiritual journey when we've learned not to take our beliefs as being the final arbiter of reality. When we can doubt um, doubt our beliefs. So at this point, it's really helpful to, when our mind starts telling us ourselves something, that we can just hold it with a grain of salt. We don't have to take it quite so seriously. The other thing that's really valuable at this point is just to recognize, even conceptually, just the immensity, the wonder of life as a whole, of which we are an integral part. So just the amazing fact of creation, and that we were fortunate enough to be present for a short while, um, to witness this creation, uh, is immense. I mean, it is wondrous. And so even conceptually, if we can put some degree of trust into that life force that is so much larger than our individual will and intellect, that can be helpful. Um, I mean, it is extraordinary enough that creation exists at all. Out of nothingness, there is this creation. There's this awareness. There's our awareness of the creation in all its, millions of forms. Okay? That's amazing. Um, what's even more amazing is that it is apparently originating out of what? Out of what would seem much more likely, which is nothing at all. So there's a story about mythical story about mankind being made out of clay. That's pretty amazing, right? What's even more amazing is how the clay was manifested in the first place. Something out of nothing. So we can um, hopefully that you would think that that would be compelling enough evidence to allow us to relax a little during this transition process, to be able to trust that life force that is moving us in a direction um, beyond our concepts, beyond our comfort zone, beyond what we thought we were. Um, but hopefully there can be some trust in that process also. I'm not saying, it's going to absolve all fears, but um, it can be really helpful just to have some trust in that. Not trust in a belief that the outcome will be as I would like it to be. Not that kind of trust. Just trust in the magnificence of that life force that is um, pushing us, pushing us, nudging us through this process. Okay, so we can't actually surrender, but what we can do is really look at those things that are holding this false belief about who we are in place. That we can do. Um, and we can also notice that this awareness that we can step back into at any moment um, is already not in the world of form, right? The world of form has certain characteristics. One, it is impermanent. Everything is always in the midst of change. Everything's coming and going. Um, Another aspect of form is that it is, there's always a cause, right? It's not an independent anything. Everything is arising out of a certain set of conditions and a certain form arises. Awareness, on the other hand, isn't caused, it's just simply present. It's also not moving. It's not subject to the law of impermanence. It is just there, right? Just every time we stop long enough to look, there it is. Even when we're not looking and busy occupying ourselves with something else, it's still fully present. It's just the attention is shifted, to the object rather than the subject. That awareness is, by its very nature, not subject to harm, because it's not in the world of form. Mind, memory, thoughts, feelings, those are all subject to, getting hurt. We all know that. But the awareness itself is already open, open-hearted, non-judgmental, and loving. Loving not in a, well, it can be in a romantic way also, but loving, the way I'm speaking of it, is from the perspective of incapable of turning away. It will be present regardless, for whatever. That that degree of openness and love. And um, if that identity is shifted away from an individual separate self into that open-hearted awareness, um, how that moves through life has a vastly different feel than that form moving through life as a separate individual. Vastly different. So we could call this, faceless self, this openness to whatever arises within the world of form, whatever appears within this field of awareness. Um, you could call that our original face. You could call it our third eye. You could call it just awareness. We could call it spaciousness. You could call it lots of things. What's important is the direct experience of um, being in the world from the perspective of this alive space that is beyond form. That's what's actually living this life. So that's the whole movement. That's what actually surrender results in. Surrender results in giving up the identity in a false sense of separate self. That's as bad as it gets. That's what we that's what we're holding on to so tightly. And that transition can be relatively easy if we approach it with an attitude of willingness, you know, longing, earnestness. Um, we approach it from the perspective of hanging on, grasping, holding on to the familiar, um, functioning out of fear rather than going through fear. Um, it doesn't stop the process, but it can slow it down and just make it much more difficult than it needs to be. So there can be this trust that allows that movement to happen. We can't do it, but we can look at how we're holding on. That we can do. Um, so as we move in that direction, there can be this sense of loss of personal will, right? That's really what's at stake here. I want what I want. So we've heard the biblical prayer, thy will be done. And the way that's sometimes said is that as a separate individual, um, I've perhaps a little reluctantly or under duress have agreed to relinquish my will for the will of God. As if we as a separate self have that authority. In order to relinquish our will to the whole, um, we'd have to possess it to begin with. Feels like we do. It surely feels like it. We do. But when we really examine it closely, we can see that there is a thought, and then there's another thought, and then there's a thought that feels like a decision, and then we take some action. And the presumption is that there's some internal entity that is choosing which thoughts to have. That entity is nowhere to be found. Thoughts certainly happen, thinking certainly happens, but what is absent that we believe is real is an internal entity that is choosing which thoughts to have, making decisions about um, which thoughts to believe. That's what's not true. And we can look at that not as a philosophy, not as a belief, but just in our own direct experience. Do we ever find any mental activity that isn't a thought? And at the same time, there is this ever present consciousness, ever present awareness, that we can experience. But it's not the result of an entity having that awareness. The direct experience of it is that there is awareness. That's the direct experience. The belief that that awareness arises from the body mind is a belief. It's an assumption. Um, but the actual experience of it is that awareness exists. That's what we can know. What we can know for certain. One of the very, very few things that we can know for certain is that there's something that exists, that it feels like my most intimate I, me, but it's formless, it's alive, vibrant, it's aware, open, apparently limitless. There's no entity. And we get used to that. Strange. It's strange what we don't find, but we get used to the freedom of that, the freedom of moving through the world as this spaciousness um, that is beyond form, because it isn't a form, isn't in the world of form. You know, as a separate person, sure, we can get hurt and physically and emotionally, sure, that still happens. But the impact is far, far less when we recognize that what we truly are is this spaciousness, this open-heartedness. Um, and the fact that that is beyond harm allows us to love fully. Because there's no fear, right? No fear, there's nothing to defend, and it is already open to whatever appears within its field. So when we, first hear the expression, spiritual surrender, it feels like, oh no, my most precious possession, I'm going to be asked to give up, this sense of me. What's given up is that limited false sense of a separate self. But what's gained is the recognition of what we really are um, is already free, is already beyond this world of form, is already without limit. And yet it is absolutely able to engage in this lifetime from that place of freedom. And that's the joy of it. We can choose to hang on to our familiar, if slightly dysfunctional sense of individual personal self, hoping to um, you know, accumulate my quota of pleasurable experiences in this lifetime. Or we can recognize what we really are and have the freedom um, to experience that joy and that sense of unity. It's not even a sense of unity because we recognize that there never was separation, not possible.